demanded he step out of the car. David knew he had done nothing wrong. He hadn't even driven over the speed limit, but the way Matthews barked orders felt unsettlingly familiar. "You think you're above the law, huh?" Matthews spat, his tone sharp. He had his hand on the grip of his gun, and David could see it, his fear, his readiness for violence. It wasn't the first time David had encountered hostility, but something about this moment felt darker, more insidious. He tried to keep his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to escalate the situation. From across the street, a black woman named Erica, who was walking with her 2 young sons, stopped and watched the scene unfold. She could feel her heart beating faster, a feeling of dread rising in her chest. She had seen this story too many times on the news. "Hey," Erica shouted, her voice carrying across the street. "He didn't do anything. Leave him alone." Next to her, a Latino man, Miguel, who had been working late at the local grocery store, hesitated. He saw the nervous energy building around them and felt compelled to act. "She's right. You got no reason to harass him." Miguel joined in, his voice filled with both anger and fear. Matthews ignored them, his jaw tightening as he focused solely on David. "Step away from the vehicle." Matthews' voice shook with both command and something more, a prejudice buried deep within him that surfaced in this very moment. But the crowd wasn't quiet. Erica, now visibly upset, held her phone up, recording everything. "We see you," she yelled. "We're recording you." Tension rippled through the gathering onlookers. Black and Latino voices rose in unison, a chorus of fear and defiance, urging David to hold his ground and telling Matthews to back off. Some shouted warnings to David to stay calm, while others tried to shame Matthews into seeing reason. A white bystander, an older man named Ed who had been jogging, glanced at the commotion. He shook his head in disapproval and muttered, "He probably did something. These cops don't just pull people over for no reason." Another white couple walked out of a nearby restaurant, hearing the shouts and noticing the growing crowd. The man, annoyed at the disruption, called out, "Just listen to the officer." "Stop resisting." His wife clutched his arm, her face a mask of unease, but she said nothing. Matthews seemed to feed off the support from these voices. His posture stiffened with authority. He pulled out his baton, tapping it against his leg as he repeated, "Step out of the vehicle now." The crowd's agitation grew louder. Erica's sons clung to her, their eyes wide with fear, and she tried to reassure them while still shouting her protests. "Don't you hurt him?" she yelled. The murmurs from the white bystanders became sharper, a few voices muttering, "Someone needs to teach these people to respect the police." It was like a knife twisting in the already deep wound of this confrontation, reinforcing the divide. David, feeling the weight of both the crowd's anxiety and Matthews' aggression, took a deep breath. He knew he had to keep his voice steady, his actions measured. But inside, anger and betrayal simmered. All he wanted was to get home to his family, and yet here he was treated like a criminal, not because of what he had done, but because of how he looked. "Sir," David said, his voice calm and firm, "I'm cooperating with you. Please tell me what I've done wrong." Matthew's eyes narrowed, and the baton in his hand seemed to twitch with anticipation. "Step out of the car or I'll drag you out," he said, his voice low and threatening. The comment drew gasps from the crowd and Erica began to cry, her phone still recording. When David finally stepped out, hands raised, the officer roughly grabbed his arm, shoving him against the car. The shouts from the crowd reached a fever pitch. Miguel cursed under his breath, hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to run forward. The white bystanders exchanged looks of disdain, a few muttering words like troublemaker or he had it coming, while others averted their eyes, too uncomfortable to confront what was happening right in front of them. David's dignity felt stripped away in front of all those eyes, some pleading, some judging, and some entirely indifferent. But he kept his eyes forward, trying to block out the voices that wanted him to fight and those that wanted to see him fail. The police cruiser pulled into the station, its sirens blaring into the still night. David sat in the back seat, wrists bound tightly behind him. The metal of the handcuffs bit into his skin, but he forced himself to breathe evenly. He knew he needed to stay composed, but it wasn't easy. Anger and humiliation twisted in his chest like a knife. When they entered the station, the fluorescent lights hummed with an almost aggressive brightness. The officers milling around glanced up briefly before returning to their paperwork or conversation, some giving David a look of mild curiosity, while others exchanged knowing smirks. To them, this was just another routine arrest, another day on the job. As Officer Matthews led David inside, David caught snippets of conversations. One officer, a heavy-set man with thinning hair, nudged his partner and muttered, "What do we have here?" Another thug in fatigues. They both chuckled darkly, their laughter dripping with disdain. David clenched his jaw. He wanted to respond, but he knew the consequences of letting his anger show. He had faced taunts before, from fellow soldiers who questioned his rank, and from strangers who looked at him with suspicion. But hearing it here, in a place that was supposed to uphold the law, cut deeper than he could have imagined. A younger officer, sitting at the booking desk, looked up and snorted when he saw David's uniform. "Guess even the army has its fair share of criminals," he remarked, not bothering to keep his voice down. His partner laughed, shaking his head as if this was an inside joke between them. Officer Matthews didn't seem fazed by the comments. If anything, he seemed encouraged. He pushed David forward with a little more force than necessary, grinning when David stumbled slightly. "Careful now," Matthews said with a smirk, his words dripping with mockery. "Wouldn't want you to get hurt, General." A couple of officers nearby raised their eyebrows at the title, and one of them asked, "This guy's a general? In what, a gang?" "More like the army of wannabe thugs," the heavy-set officer replied, and more laughter erupted. David's heart pounded in his ears. He felt stripped of everything: his years of service, his sacrifice, his identity as a father and a husband. To these men, he was nothing more than a stereotype in a uniform. His mind raced with thoughts of his wife Monica and their children. What would they think when they heard about this? How would he explain that his honor and dignity were reduced to a joke within these walls? "Where's his paperwork?" one officer asked casually, flipping through some files. "Doesn't matter," another officer replied with a shrug. "Just another one for the books." David could feel his patience wearing thin. He had spent years enduring covert and overt racism, pushing through with resilience, but this, it felt like an outright betrayal by the very system he had fought to protect. They led him into a holding cell, a small, cold room with walls that seemed to close in with every breath he took. As the door clanged shut, he felt the full weight of what had happened settle on his shoulders. He sat down on the cold bench, staring at the gray walls as he tried to make sense of the whirlwind that had torn through his life in just a few hours. Outside the cell, he could still hear the officers' conversations, their casual jokes and dismissive comments creating an oppressive atmosphere that only deepened his sense of isolation. David closed his eyes, trying to block out their voices, but the words lingered like a dark stain. "Let's hope he doesn't cry racism like the rest of them," one officer quipped, his voice carrying through the quiet hallway. David took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had been humiliated, dismissed, and dehumanized in places just like this. This was the reality he had fought against, and now it was his reality to face. In the silence of the cell, David felt both the anger and the weight of responsibility. He wasn't just another man in uniform. He was a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. The arrest of General David Washington had been sudden, unjust, and terrifying. However, the consequences of that single, racially charged moment did not stop with him being handcuffed on the side of the road. Within hours, the video footage of the incident, taken by bystanders, exploded across social media platforms. The clip, only a few minutes long, showed David standing tall and calm, being thrown against his car, handcuffed for no discernible reason. His military fatigues, once a symbol of his service and honor, now seemed to mean nothing to Officer Greg Matthews or the system that had allowed this to happen. The video was shared thousands of times within the first few hours, accompanied by captions like, "Another black man humiliated by the system, and does service to your country mean nothing if you're black?" Comments beneath the posts lit up with fury, disbelief, and heartbreak. But they also exposed something darker: the deep racial divide that was tearing at the country's very seams. On one side, people of color and allies expressed outrage, their words burning with anger and frustration at yet another injustice. Comments flooded in. "This has to stop. How many more times do we need to see this happen? He served this country, and this is how we repay him." They only saw his skin, not his service. Sickening. "We're tired of watching our fathers, brothers, and sons treated like this." But as fast as these voices rose, the counter-narrative from the other side wasn't far behind. Those defending the police actions spewed venomous words, attempting to justify Matthews' arrest of David. Many used coded and sometimes outright racist language, revealing the biases that lay just beneath the surface of the conversation. If he wasn't guilty, he wouldn't have acted so suspicious. Cops don't just pull you over for no reason. He must have done something wrong. Maybe if black men followed the law, they wouldn't get arrested. This country is too soft on people who don't belong here. I don't care if he's a general, the police were right to act. The racial divide had never been clearer. This wasn't just about David Washington anymore. His face, stoic and dignified even as he was wrongfully arrested, became the symbol of a long, festering wound in America's soul. The video sparked outrage, but the comments, racist and supportive alike, lit the match that sent protests blazing across the nation. From the urban streets of Los Angeles to the southern suburbs of Atlanta, protests erupted. In Columbus, where David lived, the streets became a battleground of voices. Protesters marched with signs that read, "Black Lives Matter" and "No Justice, No Peace," their cries echoing through the night. But as the crowds grew, so did the tension. Counter-protesters waving American flags and carrying signs that said, "Support the blue and back the badge," showed up too, and soon, the shouting matches between the two sides escalated. At the heart of it all, David remained silent, but the world outside his home was shouting for him. Inside his house, David sat in the quiet, his phone vibrating constantly, with calls from reporters, civil rights organizations, and friends he hadn't spoken to in years. His wife, Monica, watched him closely, sensing the storm building within him. "David," she said softly one evening as they sat on the couch, watching the news coverage of the protests, "you're going to have to say something. The world's waiting for you." David shook his head, his hands clasped tightly. "I don't know what to say. They've made this about more than me, Monica. This is about a system that's broken, and I'm just another name." Monica leaned in closer, resting her hand on his. "Maybe you're another name. But this time, people are watching. They're ready for change." But the change wouldn't come easily. Every time the video was played on television, every time it was shared on social media, the divide deepened. Some demanded justice for David, others doubled down in their defense of Officer Matthews, ignoring the racial injustice before their eyes. As the protests grew louder and more intense, the Columbus Police Department found itself under siege. Officers were stretched thin, fielding media inquiries, managing public safety at the protests, and dealing with their internal unease. But the department's leadership knew they couldn't stay silent for long. The pressure was mounting, and they needed to respond fast. 2 days after the video had gone viral, the Columbus police chief, Gregory Walters, held a press conference. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward him as he stepped to the podium, his face stern. Behind him, a row of officers stood, their expressions unreadable. "Good afternoon," Chief Walters began, his voice low but authoritative. "We are aware of the incident involving Officer Greg Matthews and General David Washington. We understand that this incident has caused significant public concern, and I want to assure the community that we are conducting a full investigation." The room buzzed with whispers, the reporters barely containing their questions. Walters continued, "At this time, Officer Matthews is on administrative leave, and we are thoroughly reviewing all evidence, including the footage that has been circulating on social media. However," he paused, and the reporters leaned in closer, "I want to clarify that Officer Matthews' actions were in line with protocol." A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the room. David Washington matched the description of an individual involved in a crime earlier that evening, Walters said, his tone measured. Given the situation, Officer Matthews acted out of caution to ensure public safety. The air in the room grew thick with tension. The reporter's hands shot up, but Walters continued speaking, his voice unwavering. "We must remember that our officers put their lives on the line every day. They are tasked with making split-second decisions, often under intense pressure. We cannot rush to judgment without all the facts." With that, Walters ended the conference abruptly, leaving the reporters to scramble with their questions still hanging in the air. Outside, the public response was swift and furious. The police department's attempt to justify the arrest by saying David matched the description struck a nerve, particularly in the Black and Latino communities. The phrase was laced with racial stereotyping. How many times had Black and Latino men been told they matched the description simply because of their skin color? Social media exploded with fury. Hashtags like "matchet the description" and "racial profiling" now trended for days. The phrase became a rallying cry for those protesting racial profiling, and it only fueled the anger brewing on the streets. At one protest, a young Black woman held up a sign that read, "How many more of us match the description?" Next to her, an elderly Latino man, who had lived through the civil rights movement, nodded solemnly. "I've heard this all before," he muttered, shaking his head. "They always say we match the description." As the protests surged, so did the police presence. Clad in riot gear, they lined the streets, attempting to keep order but only increasing the tension. The protesters felt the weight of the police gaze, their shields and batons like an ever-present reminder of the power imbalance that had put David in handcuffs in the first place. Meanwhile, within the police department, the attempt to spin the narrative had backfired. Even some officers, particularly those of color, felt uncomfortable with how the situation was being handled. Officer Luis Hernandez, a Latino cop who had been on the force for 15 years, muttered to his partner, "This match the description line isn't going to cut it anymore. People are tired of hearing it. Hell, I'm tired of hearing it. Hell, tired of hearing it." His partner, a young white officer fresh out of the academy, shrugged. "Protocols are protocols, right?" Hernandez's eyes narrowed. "You really think this is just about protocol? This is bigger than one arrest. This is about what we're trained to see, who we're trained to see as a threat." The divide wasn't just on the streets, it was growing within the department too. Officers like Hernandez, who had seen firsthand how racial biases shaped policing, were losing patience. The system they knew was broken, and no amount of press conferences could fix that. The police's attempt to control the narrative had only ignited more fury. The protests grew louder, the calls for reform stronger, and David Washington's face became a symbol of a man who had served his country only to be betrayed by the very system he had sworn to protect. The world was watching, and no one was going to stay silent anymore. The media frenzy surrounding David Washington's arrest was almost inevitable in today's world of 24/7 news cycles. At first, the story was small, a routine arrest blown out of proportion, according to some. A black man detained for a minor traffic violation wasn't headline news, at least. That's what certain media outlets subtly insinuated. But when the video went viral, showing the raw aggression and baselessness of the arrest, everything changed. Suddenly, news stations couldn't ignore the public outrage that flooded social media and community protests. Yet, instead of reporting the truth of racial injustice, some news outlets leaned into sensationalism. Headlines painted David not as a man wrongfully profiled, but as a questionable figure. Was this decorated general really innocent? One talk show host mused, the camera zooming in on the grainy footage of his arrest. The host's tone was laced with skepticism. On a primetime show, a particularly controversial TV personality leaned forward, her voice dripping with insinuation. Well, if he wasn't guilty, why was he so nervous? The question hung in the air, giving breath to the racist undercurrent that David's fear was somehow proof of his guilt. They downplayed his military service, only emphasizing it after the backlash became too strong to ignore, and even then, his identity as a black man took center stage in their framing. Viewers at home, many of whom were already wrestling with the complexities of systemic racism, were fed a narrative that blamed David for his own victimization. Despite this, the truth had already been seen by millions. David's calm demeanor during the traffic stop, the way his voice never wavered even as Officer Matthews escalated the situation. The media's attempt to muddy the waters only intensified the divide, fueling protests that called for a change, not just in policing, but in the way stories of black men like David were told. The small conference room was cold and uninviting, with its beige walls and harsh fluorescent lights. David sat in silence, his hands clasped together, waiting. He wasn't sure what he expected from this meeting. He certainly didn't expect closure. Forgiveness wasn't even on the table. But maybe, just maybe, there would be understanding.
The door creaked open, and Officer Greg Matthews walked in, looking more fragile than the aggressive figure David remembered from that night. Matthews looked smaller, like a man whose world had come crashing down. He hesitated at the doorway, his eyes flicking nervously before he found the courage to sit across from David.
For a moment, the air was thick with silence. Neither man spoke, each trapped in their own thoughts. Finally, Matthews cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice shaky, almost unsure. David said nothing, just watched. "I grew up in a household where there was a lot of racism. My father, my uncles, they always talked about people like you." He admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "People who didn't look like us." Matthews swallowed hard, as if the words themselves were stuck in his throat. "I never questioned it," he continued, his gaze finally meeting David's. "When I joined the police academy, I didn't realize how much those beliefs had shaped me. We were taught to profile, to suspect, especially if someone looked like you. I never even thought to question it. It was just ingrained." David's face remained unreadable, though his mind was a whirlwind. Hearing Matthews confess the systemic racism that had been drilled into him was a bitter pill to swallow. But it was the truth David had known all along, the truth that every black man in America knows too well. "I know I can't take back what I did," Matthews continued, his voice trembling now. "And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it. I needed you to know that. I see it now. I see how I let this system, how I let myself hurt you." David leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about you, Matthews. It's about a system that's been built on this kind of bias. A system that sees black skin as a threat, You were just a part of it, but it's bigger than both of us. Matthews nodded slowly, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He hadn't expected this meeting to be easy, but the weight of his actions, now fully realized, was almost too much to bear. The room was silent again, heavy with the shared burden of an unjust world. The sun was setting behind the city skyline as David Washington stood on the makeshift stage, overlooking the sea of faces before him. The energy in the crowd was palpable, angry, hopeful, determined. They had come from all corners of the city, from every background, every race, all united in one purpose: justice. David had spoken to troops, commanded men in war zones, but this felt different. This wasn't about military strategy. This was about survival, his children's, and every black person who had ever feared for their life in a country that promised them equality but delivered something far darker. He took a deep breath and gripped the microphone. "Good evening," he began, his voice echoing over the crowd. "I stand before you today not just as a man who was wrongfully arrested. I stand before you as a black man who has faced this kind of injustice my entire life." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. "I've served this country for over 20 years. I've fought in wars, I've led humanitarian missions, I've seen the worst of humanity. But I never thought the fight I would be fighting today would be here, in my own home." David's voice cracked slightly, the weight of his trauma rising to the surface. "That night, I wasn't just another black man driving home. I was a father, a husband, a soldier. But none of that mattered. All Officer Matthews saw was my skin." The crowd murmured, a wave of anger and frustration rolling through them. "I've been told to stay silent, to let the system handle this. But the system has failed us for too long. How many more of us have to be arrested, beaten, killed before something changes?" His voice grew louder, more powerful. "This fight is bigger than me. It's bigger than any one person. This is about our children. My son, my daughter, they deserve better. Your children deserve better. We deserve better." Tears welled in David's eyes as he looked out at the crowd, now cheering, their fists raised in solidarity. "We are not asking for anything more than what we are owed: justice, equality, freedom, and we won't stop until we get it." The roar of the crowd was deafening, their chants of no justice, no peace echoing through the streets. David stood tall, a beacon of strength, knowing that this was only the beginning. Alone in his small apartment, Greg Matthews sat at his kitchen table, staring at the wall. The noise from the protests outside was a constant hum, a reminder of the chaos he had helped set in motion. He had been fired from the force he knew it was coming. But what he hadn't expected was the weight of guilt that now consumed him. He had been attending anti-bias workshops for weeks now, listening to stories from people who had been on the other side of that badge, people like David. At first he had sat in the back, silent, arms crossed, convinced that none of this was his fault. He was just doing his job. But with each story, each tearful testimony, something inside him began to shift. He thought back to his childhood, to the way his father would talk about black men, how they were dangerous, lazy criminals. Matthews had never questioned it. And then, in the academy, it was the same. They were taught to profile, to suspect. And he did, without thinking. But now, he couldn't stop thinking. The faces of every black man he had ever pulled over haunted him. The way they would keep their hands visible, their voices calm but tight with fear. He had never noticed it before. But now, it was all he could see. Greg Matthews was a man unraveling. The system he had once believed in had been exposed for what it was: a machine built to oppress. And he had been a part of it. But what now? What did redemption look like for a man like him? He didn't know. He only knew that he couldn't go back. Not to the force. Not to the life he had known.